Well, guess what? The EU wants to get even bigger. That's right. The 27 countries in the European Union could soon be increased to 29. The European Commission has said that the Ukraine and Moldova should start the process of becoming EU members. Well, here with me now in the studio to discuss this is the Deputy Leader of Reform UK, Mr. Brexit, Ben Habib. Ben, it's always a pleasure to see you.
Good to see you.
What's bringing this on? It'll be the biggest expansion of the EU in 20 years. Obviously missing Britain, perhaps.
Well, we had deep pockets. These two countries hardly have any pockets between them. One of them is a war-torn country, obviously, and the other one is, the only way to describe it is poor. And I think what you're seeing here, Martin, is what you and I have known about the EU for a long time, and I think the vast majority of viewers will know, is that it isn't really an economic trading bloc. It's a political movement. It's a political aim that it's got to encompass as much of Europe as it possibly can, bring it closer into union, and for Brussels effectively to spread its hegemony on a broader and broader basis. There can't be any economic case to bring Ukraine or Moldova into the EU. They don't meet the economic criteria required to join the euro, which would be a prerequisite of joining. They don't meet the law and order requirements. Ukraine, without wishing to offend all those that wrap themselves in the virtuous cloak of the promotion of Ukraine has a law and order rating that is below Uganda. And you wouldn't have Uganda in the, or perhaps we will have Uganda in the EU one day. But what we're seeing is the EU increasingly spreading its wings geopolitically, taking in more and more countries. And we're also seeing this, as you know, in the establishment of its own alternative to NATO, which is permanent structured cooperation. It's got its own now EU-badged militia, if you like, called Frontex, available to be deployed in any member state at their invitation.
It's interesting that because, when we were in the European Parliament, we heard Ursula von der Leyen, make a pitch for the European army. Nick Clegg told us that was a dangerous fantasy. Is that part of the point here? Do you think that frontier with Russia, which Ukraine certainly takes in, and Moldova, is this a move towards them becoming something of a kind of bargain basement NATO?
Yeah, well, I mean, they absolutely want to have foreign policy, and if you're going to have foreign policy as an institution, you've got to have an armed force, effectively. And they are heading absolutely in that direction. There's no mistake about it at all. They don't hide it. They have something called the European Defence Fund, which is for the development of military research with an EU political aim, underpinned by interoperability across member states. So member state armies and air forces and so on can cooperate and move seamlessly together. Now, what you don't know, I'm slightly digressing, but people should know, is that the United Kingdom has joined the European Defence Fund, and they will want to soak our military in with theirs as well. And the other thing that they're doing, which is remarkable, is they're having negotiations with Georgia, too, to bring Georgia into the EU. Another kind of red flag to Russia, but quite entirely consistent with their geopolitical aims and the desire to have a foreign policy and to spread their wings. The EU is a political project. It is not an economic one, and we're seeing that more and more clearly every day that passes.
And so, Ben, as well as the military pull-in, as well as the cost of that, why else might this expansionism of the EU be bad news for Britain?
Well, I mean, what I really hope is that by some miracle, we don't get sucked into these, their expansion and into the broader institutions of the EU. Sadly, again, as you know as well as I do, when we left the EU, we left the institutions, but we remain hitched at the hip. And my biggest fear actually is PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. The last thing we want in this country is for our military to be under the diktat of Brussels. That would be a disaster. By the way, they have very bad form for foreign policy too. This is an institution that was trying to step round sanctions imposed by the US on Iran back in 2019. It was trying to set up its own clearing system to avoid the dollar clearing system, which is the mechanism by which the US enforces its sanctions. It was trying to step around those sanctions. Iran, the regime that is now funding Hamas, or has been funding Hamas for many years, and we've seen the damage that's done. And the EU have repeatedly made similar mistakes. They weren't with us over Iraq. You know, they stood out against the United Kingdom and the US. Perhaps they do it just to inflame us. Perhaps they do it to emphasise their independence. But they're not helpful as allies.
And in terms of corruption, Ukraine is 116th out of 180 in the world.
Well, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
91 out of 180 in the world. These are not functioning, healthy democracies.
No, they're not.
What about the concept of freedom of movement? Because, of course, suddenly the Moldovans, you presume, as soon as they get in the EU bloc, they'll be clearing off into Europe, and they could definitely wash towards our shores.
They could wash being the operative word for the way people get to the United Kingdom. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's not just bad for Europe, that. It's bad for Moldova and Ukraine, too. I've worked in Romania and, to a lesser extent, in Bulgaria, and they've had an exodus of people as a result of freedom of movement. And that damages fundamentally their economy as well. You know, we get the burden of immigration in Western Europe and all that goes with it, the kind of Ponzi scheme, and they have an absence of a workforce.
I want to very quickly ask you, as I've got you here, about Suella Braverman's comments today. Do you think she should go, or could she be a saviour for the Conservatives?
Suella calls a spade a spade. She's a straight-talking, clear-thinking politician. Those marches, to which she was referring in her article in The Times that's caused so much consternation, were infected with hate and with belligerence. We all saw the images, people hiding behind scarves on their face, carrying the ISIS black flag, demanding an intifada, an uprising between London and Gaza, demanding jihad, and even demanding we, the British people, declare which side we're on. Well, I'm on the side of the United Kingdom, and the side of the United Kingdom doesn't tolerate that kind of speech. And if they have any decency, these people, if they recognise that they're part of a country that champions freedom, where people have died in order to afford them that freedom, they won't march on Saturday and Sunday, and they will respect those who have died for that freedom.
Ben Habib, excellent analysis as ever, super stuff. Thank you very much.